think this is the third time I've been here. The first time was, I forgot, 8 years ago maybe, or something like that. And then the second time was just about a year ago at your annual dinner, at a stressful time in my life when I was in the midst, or had just departed, I think, from the Gazette. And I thought when I left the Gazette, I was going to get even, and I did. I wrote that book. And now you're looking at a new man. I feel fully refreshed. It's off my chest. From Dieburg to Jerusalem. Dieburg is short for Dwaynesburg. It just fits better on the cover. People would sometimes say to me at the Gazette, you know what you ought to do? They say you ought to collect your columns, put them in a book. And I couldn't see people buying a book of my collected columns. I thought anybody who likes my columns has already read them. Why are you going to pay money to read them twice? And besides, and this book is not a collection of columns, by the way. And besides, a book, to my way of thinking, ought to have a beginning, middle, and an end. I don't like things that are just sort of random collections. And then when my career at the Gazette came to its unhappy termination last year, I said, well, there's an end. Now we've got an end. Was there a beginning? I asked myself. And I thought back to my early years at the Gazette, and I thought, well, maybe there was. I arrived here. This is my home area. I grew up in Saratoga, was born and raised in Saratoga. Got married in Asia, and brought back the evidence. Who is here as my bodyguard today, and we needed. I came back to help my parents in the their declining days. Figured we'd be here some short time. I needed a job to sort of put food on the table for a short while. I figured with my vast experience, I was overqualified for anything the Capital Region might have to offer. But I did need some income. I thought I would do the Saratogian a favor and work for them for a while. So I dropped into their office and got the brush off. It was the most sobering thing in my life. They were not interested in the slightest. And I kind of, dusted myself off, trekked down to Schenectady, where I had been maybe 3 times in my life, went to the Daily Gazette, of all absurd places, and humbly applied for employment there. And they told me they had an opening, that their Rotterdam reporter had just submitted his resignation, and if I liked, I could be their Rotterdam reporter. Well, I figured they'd make me the editor at least. Rotterdam reporter, despite having grown up in Saratoga, I wasn't sure I'd ever even heard of Rotterdam. But that's what I got. I got a Rotterdam reporter, and I can't tell you how demeaning it was to have to sit through these planning board meetings and sewer councils and whatever, and then go back and write inane stories about these events. And it was really depressing. And the worst was yet to come, because I found out very shortly that Rotterdam, for the Gazette's purposes, included not only the town of Rotterdam itself, but also the outlying rural areas of Dwaynesburg and Princetown. And if Rotterdam was depressing, it was nothing compared to Dwaynesburg. If you've never been to a Dwaynesburg town board meeting, let me tell you, don't go. They're the most belligerent people out there. The only entertainment they have is going to the monthly town board meeting and berating the councilman and berating the supervisor over almost nothing. Because Dwaynesburg, no fault of their own, really has no business to conduct. It's, the main item on the agenda is likely to be whether the sand and gravel this winter ought to be heaped, behind the garage or alongside the garage. And they'll get up and they'll shout at each other and they'll call each other names. I remember the guy who came in and had a fit because he had been watching the snowplow drivers out there, and they took a break and they were in the diner and he timed them. And 25 minutes later, they were still in that diner. And one of the councilmen, tried to explain, well, it's very cold weather, they work hard, they're up at 3 o'clock in the morning, they need a break. And the guy responded, he says, what are they, women? And I'm sitting there, you know, writing this stuff down, month after translate this into a news story, translate it into journalese, into newspaperese. It was awful. It was just awful. And the lowest of the low, I think, came the night that they were discussing how to paint the roof of the town garage. The roof had deteriorated, they needed to put a new coat of paint on it, and they were as obstreperous about that as they were about any other subject. And the dividing line was between those who thought the paint ought to have fiber into it, as they phrased it, and those who thought it didn't, that fiber into the paint would make it too expensive. Then they went on and on with this discussion, how much it cost per gallon, whether you couldn't get it cheaper by a 5-gallon can, who was going to volunteer to get up on the roof, they finally decided they were going to appoint the supervisor, the town supervisor, to be what they call ground man. He'd be moving the ladder. His job would be to stand down the bottom and move the ladder while the other guys were up on the roof. I was close to slitting my wrist. I'm a journalist, for God's sake. I covered the Vietnam War. You know, I covered combat operations. And so I got back to the Gazette that night, probably about 9:30 or something. I had half an hour to crank in a story for the next day's paper. And it was a low point for me. And in absolute disgust, I said to myself, the hell with it. I am not going to dress this up. I'm not going to write the standard, you know, predictable news story out of this. I'm just going to tell it like it is. I'm going to tell it what happened. I'm going to recount this inane debate they had. I'm going to quote these. I had the words in my notebook. I'm going to quote these guys exactly what they said. Councilman so-and-so said the paint's got to have fiber into it. Supervisor so-and-so responded, you know, that'll cost $18 a gallon. We've only got 50 and so forth. I'm just going to quote them. I just let it speak for itself. And I did. I typed this thing in anger. Just not so much at Waynesburg really as at myself for having fallen so low in life. Turned the story in, expecting that it would not run in the paper. I mean, it was just the stupidest story anybody could believe. They're never going to print this thing. Well, at that time, the Gazette, and even today, really, the Gazette prints almost anything. They've got to fill the space. It's 10:30 at night. You got 18 inches of space between two ads. What are you going to put in there? Here's a reporter submitting 18 inches of copy. Bam, you slap it in and off you go. So I get up the next morning, sure enough, there it was in the paper. Oh my God. Yeah. I came into work, the telephone was ringing, people were calling up and they're saying, it's the funniest story I ever read. The town supervisor called me up, he said, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So I looked back on that and I said it was kind of a turning point for me. Here's the story. The copy desk put a headline on it, Paint, Dilemma for Dwaynesburg. And a nice Gazette touch, dilemma misspelled. But I decided then and there, you know, if I'm going to be a small town reporter, maybe this is the way to do it. Don't try to improve on events, just tell them like they are. And this is what I set out to do. I'm compressing a bit of history here into a short, but that was the long and the short of it. I said, I'm just going to tell these things the way they are. I'm going to tell them in plain English, and the devil take the hindmost. And eventually, I rose to the glorious heights of columnist. From Rotterdam reporter to Schenectady City Hall reporter to assistant city editor, and then I say the very Empyrean of journalism. They gave me a column not because they wanted to write me, not because they wanted me to write a column, but because they made me an assistant city editor because they needed one, and I didn't want to be an editor. It's very tedious work, unsatisfying, uncreative, and I took the job with the promise from the managing editor that if I didn't like it, if I didn't like being one of the city editors, they gave me a raise to take it, and they said after 6 months, if you decide you don't want to do it, you can go back to being a reporter and keep the raise. I said, okay, that sounds like a good deal, I'll do it. After 6 months, I said, I can't stand this. I want to be a reporter again. They said, sorry, we don't have an opening at the moment. So I continued this tedious job, and every 2 weeks or so I'd go into the editor's office and I'd say, how about I really don't want to do this. Can, give me a, I want to be a reporter, I want to be a writer. And he kept brushing me off, and finally in desperation to get me out of his office, he says, how'd you like to try writing a column? And I said, well, okay, I mean, anything's better than being an editor. So that's how I got the column. It wasn't that they wanted me to do it, it wasn't that I wanted to do it. But anyway, when my job came to its dreadful termination last year, after 25 years of this, I looked back and I said, where did it begin? If I want to write this up, and I did, I had an end. And I don't know if that's the right way to begin a book, but I figured if I want to write a book, I've got an end to it. What was the beginning? And I figured that was the beginning. The painting of the town garage roof. And hence the title, From Dieburg to Jerusalem. And of course there's a lot in between. There are all the shenanigans and hijinks of the Schenectady Police Department, which kept me afloat for my first few years. I applied to them what I came to think of as the Duanesburg principle. Don't dress it up. Don't dress it up. Just look and see what they're doing. Look and see who says what, and just write it down, and let the chips fall where they may. It was great fun. It was great fun. I made more enemies in 25 years than I thought humanly possible. I absolutely exhausted the wells of anger in the police department and turned my attention to the teachers' union and started all over again. I think I had teachers in the 3-county area just loathing and despising me as much as the police had. I apologize to any of those among you who may be teachers or retired teachers, but it kept bread on the table for us for several years, as eventually Steve Rossi did at the Schenectady School Board. I was really in the doldrums at that time. You remember when the 2 Muslim men here in Albany were set up by the FBI, that really grotesque miscarriage of justice, in my view. I got terrifically fired up about it. It's recounted in the book. I sort of retell that story. And one of the worst things I've ever covered in my life, bar none. And when that ran its course, again, it's kind of a series of ups and downs, a lot of downs. But when that ran its course, I was in the doldrums, sort of didn't have anything to do, and then got saved by Steve Rossi at the Schenectady School Board, the guy who was planting explosives on the vehicles of employees who had crossed him. Put food on their table for another year. And then after that, it was in the doldrums again. I finally hit upon the immensely rich, and now I was really pushing the envelope, and I don't want to walk you through because I think I talked to you about this last year. Had a great deal of fun with evangelical Protestants and the creationism business, masquerading as intelligent design. Ran with that as far as I could, then squeezed all the juice I could out of the Protestants, turned my attention to the Catholics with St. Catherine, which is another absolute delight. I give myself credit. I do very little boasting in the book. I would say that to my credit. Very little boasting. I am a humble person, but I do allow myself to boast of having been the only journalist, as far as I know, in the world who, when St. Catherine was given credit for healing this boy of the dreadful infection in his hospital bed in Seattle, the only journalist in the world who called the hospital and actually spoke to a doctor to see if the boy might have gotten any medical care that had anything whatsoever to do with his recovery. That too was a wonderful one. And then I made the huge mistake. Pearl and I were trying to spend down the vast wealth I'd accumulated at the Gazette, and we began traveling every year. We went to India, we went to Morocco, and various other exotic and ancient places, and I fixed on Jerusalem as a likely target for our attentions, not our journalistic attentions, but our touristic attentions. And one thing led to another, and I'm not going to repeat that dismal tale, but that ultimately led to my departure from the Gazette. I found I could be irreverent about the Duanesburg Town Board and the mighty Catholic Church, but I could not be irreverent about Judaism and Israel. That they enjoy a level of immunity that I had not previously been aware of. And it came as a shock to me. And it's still something of a shock. I mean, I've pretty much absorbed it by now, but at the time it was a shock. And I set myself, I do recount the end in the book, how that came about. I sort of walked through that. But then I set myself the task of finding out if what happened to me had happened to anyone else. And indeed it had. It turns out it's a common experience. For people who speak out forcibly against Israel, much less ridiculing Judaism, forget it, you know, ridiculing the religion. But even, you know, just speaking out really forcibly, as I think I did, I hope I did, about Israel, there is a pattern of behavior of the fierce defenders of Israel to come down on that person, not just in vigorous disagreement, the way the Catholic Church and the way the Protestants vigorously disagreed with me, wrote letters to the editors saying how terrible I am and I don't appreciate God's work and, you know, all the rest of it, which is fair enough. Not just that within the case of Israel and Judaism, but in an attempt to absolutely silence the person, to put you out of business, to get you fired, to keep your works from being published. That is the effort, and what I experienced was just a very small example of it. It turned out it didn't take a whole lot of research. I mean, if you get into Google and start typing in various keywords, I don't even remember what I typed in at the beginning. Pretty soon, you come up with Helen Thomas at UPI for, I think it was something like 200 years, and then with the Hearst papers for another 80 years. You know, she was really ancient, and she had covered every president since John Adams or something like that, and made the mistake at Jewish Heritage Appreciation Day. I didn't even know there was such a day. Jewish Heritage Appreciation Day at the White House. She was caught on the White House. I shouldn't say caught. She was approached on the White House lawn by a rabbi with a cell phone camera or something, and said, and she had made previously, apparently, I wasn't aware of this, had made critical remarks about Israel. She was known as a critic of Israel, which I didn't know. Pardon me? You know, she's in error, she says. You know, I hear that, she's in error, as if that accounts for it. I'm not in error. Yeah. I'm not in error. And, you know, we say that, the New York Times, I don't mean to jump on you, but in the New York Times obituary of her, they said, every obituary I think I saw, they say first, in like the second or third paragraph, she was a critic of Israel. You know, she left the Hearst Corps, she was fired / retired after making these, negative remarks about Israel. Next paragraph, she is the daughter or the granddaughter of Lebanese immigrants, which is a way of saying, she's an Arab. What do you expect? We wouldn't say, well, Henry Kissinger is, he's a Jew, so, what do you expect? No, it would be improper. But anyway, I'm not an Arab. She's an American. But anyway, she said, oh, the Jews ought to get out of Palestine, which is, I think, a stupid and unrealistic thing to say. It's nothing I would say. But that's what she said, and the roof fell in on her far worse than it did on me. It's a much bigger roof. She's a much bigger person. But, Obama himself denounced her. The White House Correspondents Association had a prize, a Lifetime Achievement Award named for her, the Helen Thomas Lifetime Achievement Award. They immediately dropped her name from it so that future recipients wouldn't be in the awkward position of having to choose whether or not to accept it with such a horrible person as Helen Thomas attached to it. Her literary agent, her book agent dropped her, her speaking agent dropped her. She was denounced, all over the place, and Obama himself denounced her, and she was fired / retired. Last year, was it beginning of 2012, was it? When Israel attacked Gaza, bombing Gaza. The Washington Post ran on its front page a picture of a Palestinian man holding a white wrapped bundle identified as his infant, his baby son. His baby son had been killed, it said, in an Israeli bombing raid. The man's face, of course, is contorted with grief, and there are a couple other people standing by him, and they're all, these grief-stricken people around this dead baby. And you couldn't really see the baby. It was, it was wrapped. I mean, it wasn't a question of gruesomeness. Sometimes newspapers are criticized for running photos that are gruesome. This was not gruesome because you couldn't see the baby's face or anything. So that was it. Palestinian, child, infant killed in an Israeli bombing raid. The news picture during the war. The Washington Post was besieged by letters and phone calls from what they identified as Jewish readers and Jewish organizations protesting this biased coverage, which, basically showed some Palestinians in a sympathetic light, and by implication, Israelis as bad guys, right? And you can't do it. I mean, the outpouring was such that they felt obliged to run by their ombudsman a lengthy defense. They did not apologize. They did not apologize, they did not back off, but they did feel obliged to run a lengthy explanation. They didn't have another photo. Someone said, why didn't you run a photo, equivalent photo of an Israeli woman, her family grieving over their death? Well, they didn't have any such photo. And besides, there were, very few Israelis killed in that business, something like 3, I think, as opposed to, however many, dozens or hundreds of Palestinians. But anyway, you can't do it. You portray the Palestinians sympathetically, boom. The establishment comes down there. By the establishment, I call them sometimes the Jewish mafia. The Anti-Defamation League, and those people who, they'll call you an anti-Semite. You say any of this stuff like I've been saying, and automatically you're an anti-Semite. The London Times, Sunday Times of London, about the same time, I think this was early 13, I lost track of the time, I think it was early this year, early 2013. At the time of the Israeli election, Netanyahu was running for re-election, parliamentary system, but anyway, he was up for re-election, and they ran a cartoon, a pretty tough cartoon, I think, showing Netanyahu plastering up a wall, a big stone wall, and he's plastering it up with red goop, presumably blood, and you could see the arms and faces of Palestinians sort of stuck in the wall. He's plastering up the Palestinians in this wall. The reference obviously being to the separation wall that Israel is building through the West Bank. And the caption was something like, I forgot what the caption was, something sarcastic about, about the peace process. Is this the way he's going to build peace or something? Once again, the reaction was tremendous. At first blush, the Sunday Times defended it, and but pretty quickly they backed off. Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Sunday Times himself, finally personally apologized for this outrageous, shameful cartoon. There was no excuse for it. And many other examples I found, which I will not, I don't want to tell them all to you because I want you to buy the book. And they're an afterword to the book. But it was an education. I didn't know this went on, but I had discovered there is a great deal of self-censorship in the American press, and I guess in the English press and some other countries, when it comes to Israel, because you know what the reaction is going to be. There's an example from CBS, 60 Minutes experienced the same thing. Peter Beinart, respected Orthodox Jewish American journalist, experienced the same thing with his book, The Crisis of Zionism, where the establishment just really comes down on you and they say they don't just disagree, they try to silence you. Norman Finkelstein, scholar at DePaul University, and really a scholar who's written some excellent books exposing the doings of the establishment and of Israel. And, Alan Dershowitz, who I call the unofficial Minister of Enforcement for the Mafia. I mean, got him, so he didn't get tenure at DePaul University. He was up for tenure, and Dershowitz ran a campaign and got him denied tenure, tried to get his books from being published by the University of California Press. It was scheduled for publication, a book exposing Dershowitz's lies, about Israel, Dershowitz not only lobbied the president of the University of California. When he got rebuffed there, he went so far as to lobby Governor Schwarzenegger, tried to get the governor of California to intervene to block publication of the book. So it's something different. It's not just, you know, vigorous debate and vigorous disagreement. It's a concerted effort to shut people up who speak out forcefully on Israel, all of which was a revelation to me. I was excited to learn about it, and I thought, I'm going to write about this. So I wrote, I put it in the last chapter of the book. And I'm sorry to end on such a gloomy and depressing note as that. It's from Dieburg to Jerusalem. That's the trajectory, is the unlikely rise and awful fall. And I thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and if you have any questions or comments, they put a shield up here in front of me, so I'm going to be prepared to crouch down if necessary. I've got Pearl standing by here. Kryptonite. Thank you. Frank?
I have one comment and one question. The comment is that I have read the book, and I want to tell everybody here, buy it. It really is a terrific book. It was a joy to read. It's just a wonderful book.
Thank you very much, Frank. I want to make clear he is not working on commission.
Question. Let me disclose my ancestry is Jewish, but in thinking about why it is that this phenomenon existed, you talk about the Jewish mafia, etc., etc. Do you suppose it has anything to do with the past history wherein, obviously, Jewish people were terribly victimized, so that there may be a greater sensitivity among them towards anything that's perceived as an assault upon them?
Yeah, I think no question about it. The history of persecution over the centuries, I have learned, is, you know, very much alive in a lot of Jewish people, even those who you know, support me and agree with me. I find it what I wasn't aware of and since learned is common, is the use of these sufferings, particularly the genocide of World War II, the Holocaust, the use of that to kind of immunize the nation of Israel. That because the Jewish people suffered horribly over the centuries, and especially in World War II under the Nazis, this, you know, unspeakable mass murder, that now it's not fair. It's not fair for anybody, especially, you know, Gentiles, to say anything critical about the Jewish state. And I think there is a logical gap here that I'm not willing to bridge. This is the unspoken and sometimes the spoken argument. I gave a talk to a group in Schenectady a couple of weeks ago, and I said to them pretty much what I've said to you here today. And one member of the audience told me I was missing the big picture. And I said, well, what is the big picture? And he said, 6 million dead. No need even for a verb. There's not even a statement, but that's sort of the beginning and the end. And I think what's implied is 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. Therefore, the Jewish state must not be scrutinized. Now it's exempt. It's immune to criticism. And refugees from Europe, Jewish refugees from Europe and Russia, can do whatever they want to the Arab inhabitants of Palestine because their parents or their grandparents suffered these unspeakable atrocities 60 years ago. And to me, that is poor logic and worse morality. And it seems to me to cheapen the horrors of that genocide, you know, to trot that out as an excuse for dispossessing other people, for blowing up their homes, for driving them off their land, and for treating them like dirt, which is what Israel today does with the Palestinians, I think is just disgusting. I'm sorry. This is not in any way to minimize the horrors of the persecution that Jews have suffered over the centuries in Europe. Not in any way. But to make that logical jump, because Jews suffered these horrors over the centuries, now those Jews who transplanted themselves to Palestine can do whatever they want. Can ride roughshod over the native inhabitants, can drive them out of their homes, steal their land from them. I'm sorry. I refuse to make that. I refuse to make that leap. And I say I think it cheapens the Holocaust. It cheapens these other horrors, and it does not. I say it does not, in my mind anyway, logically follow.